I know what you're thinking. How in the world did we ever get to this big of a problem? Why did we let this happen? And is this so big that we cannot fix it? We're going to dive into all those things. But as we do that, you're going to see how there's been a couple very detailed plans that have changed the way we have perceived money and our debt structure as a country. We're going to look at the facts today, even as shocking as they are. But let's go look and to see first, who's at fault and how did we get here? Let's take a look at the U.S. debt and how it's grown under each presidency. It's not the problem of a Democrat or a Republican. Both have contributed to this problem. As you can see at the bottom of this chart, the color of a dozen or so presidents has been very small, the increase of the debt. And something happened, a change that happened under President Ronald Reagan. By the way, when I talk about these presidents, I'm not throwing stones at any of them. In fact, Ronald Reagan is probably one of my favorite presidents who my dad served with. So when you look at the debt, we started to see an increase. President Reagan got in office and he said, let's start funding growth. Let's lower interest rates. Let's expand the debt of the country. And the debt grew $1.86 trillion under his presidency. It was not an issue because what you call the debt to GDP, which we'll talk in a moment about, was only 34% when he left office. Then we have George H.W. Bush. He increased the debt $1.55 trillion. Bill Clinton, $1.4 trillion. George W. Bush, a big change now, $5.8 trillion. Now we're starting to see the debt escalate. President Barack Obama, $8.59 trillion. And President Donald Trump, so far, $4.78 trillion. Every president since Ronald Reagan has contributed to our debt problem. And every one of those presidents has spent more than what they projected, with the exception of one small time Bill Clinton had a budget surplus. So let's take a look at where this debt will be if President Trump gets reelected and serves another term. Where will the debt be at the end of his 2 terms? Let's take a look at that. If you look at his budget projections, obviously his plan is much higher than the baseline of the national debt. So he's going to overspend, in other words. But if we look at the projections in the next chart, at the end of his term, without any tax breaks or any more spending, which we know there's going to be more tax breaks because they're already talking about this, going to be one rolling out here in a couple months. Steve Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, announced that. And there's going to be more spending. Inevitably, the government continues to spend no matter if it's a Democrat or Republican. But going back to the chart, it's going to be $27 trillion. That's the conservative number by the end of President Trump's term. So under President Trump's leadership, he would have increased the national debt, if those numbers are accurate, at the end of his term by $7.1 trillion. Now, many of us say, well, again, how did this really start? What changed? So, due to the lack of a story called, let's pay our debt when we create our debt. In other words, when you create a financial instrument called a Treasury and a budget, you have to live within that means, kind of like we would have to do as a person or a family or a company for the most part. unfortunately, the government has lulled us into sleep thinking that they don't have to do this. So the lack of this story that says if you create a debt problem, you have to pay that debt off. Because the last time I checked, if you want to get out of a hole, you don't keep digging deeper. And if you want to get out of debt, you don't create more debt to get out of debt. It doesn't work that way. So the lack of this story was replaced with another story called the MMT. What is that? Modern monetary theory. Let's take a look at what actually that is. Modern monetary theory is complex, yet at the same time somewhat simple, as it argues several clear points. Money's value comes from the sovereign power that prints it, the Fed. Essentially, government spending is funded by debt, which is the Treasury. And if debt and deficits are removed, put on those off-balance sheet called unfunded liabilities, then more government spending can promote economic growth, full employment, government subsidized health care, such as Medicaid and Medicare, and subsidized retirement, i.e. Social Security. The problem with this theory is debt and deficits are not self-financing. When you add government debt, Treasury debt, Fed debt, unfunded liabilities, all these things, they have to be paid for at the end of the day. And that is a problem that is shackling our country. So let's take a look at government budget deficits. When a government, our government, spends more than the revenue that comes in. Let's take a look at how the chart is on that. So if you see in like 2014-15, we were overspending then. Let's go back before that in 2009 when we were in a recession. President Obama was in office. We had a 1.4 trillion budget deficits, one of the highest. Why? Because we're in a recession. People lost their jobs, the workers, careers, everything. Economically, it was a huge downturn. And so the government came to the rescue and said, let's spend a lot. $1.4 trillion in 2009 was the budget deficit. And as the economy started recovering, it took a while, obviously, and it still is somewhat recovering, the overspending of the country, or the budget, started to go down. Let's take a look at one of its lowest points in recent times, and that was 2015, when we had a budget deficit of still $430 billion. It's ballooned now back to almost at the level where it was in a recession, just shy of that, $1.1 trillion. So here we are, a booming economy, unemployment at a 50-year low, wages that are rising, careers that are being created, more jobs that are coming back to America, and America has become oil independent. We don't need Saudi Arabia oil or OPEC oil anymore. So in this environment, that's a, quote, thriving environment. Why are we ballooning our debt by creating an overspending of the budget of $1.1 trillion? We should be paying this debt down. We should not have a budget deficit. We should have a budget surplus, but we don't. And I said 2.5 years ago, when the original budget was introduced, that President Trump, I said this on national radio, he will boom the economy, but we're going to have budget deficit spending and the national debt will grow precipitously. And that's exactly where we are today. So let's take a look at when we have this budget deficit, how do we finance the $1.1 trillion? That's where the Treasury comes into effect. This is the credit card of the United States, so to speak. So let's take a look at the chart to see how much treasuries have been increased over a period of time. When you go back to 2005, There's a big change that happened in starting the end of 2007, and it ballooned. It rose significantly in 2008. Why? Because of the recession that we went into. Remember the previous chart? $1.4 trillion of budget deficit spending, of overspending, so they had to come to the rescue. The Treasury created more treasuries. So that is what subsidizes or finances our government's overspending. The Treasury creates a note. So think of it this way. A treasury, our treasury, is just the credit card to finance the lifestyle, if you want to put it that way, of the government and its overspending habits, knowing that we're probably never going to pay off this credit card. And what we keep on doing is creating another credit card at the Treasury, and another one, and another one, and another one. But let's take a look at who holds these treasuries. The Federal Reserve holds about 11.2%, and we're going to look at their balance sheet in a second. The government holds 27%. In other words, Social Security holds it, healthcare holds some of it. Foreign investors, one of the biggest holders of it, 29.3%. And U.S. investors hold their own debt, a little over 32%, 32.5%. Let's go fine-tune this and go to the Federal Reserve balance sheet. So as you can see, the same timeline. If we go back to 2008, all of a sudden there was a jump in the Fed balance sheet. And before the jump happened, and that's the crisis of 2008 there, before the jump, the Fed owned about $880 billion on their balance sheet. Their balance sheet consists, by the way, of U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. They ballooned their balance sheet over time and continue to increase their balance sheet to now it's $4.3 trillion. Well, it's actually around a little over $4 trillion, and they're saying they're going to increase it to about $4.3 trillion in the short term here coming up in April. Now let's take a look at how much the Federal Reserve has created as money. So this is the actual physical money in circulation. Looking at the chart, something happened in 2008 again. The Fed started expanding the monetary supply. This is the money system that they created artificially with low interest rates. They used the asset called treasuries and created more money. But all this is a vicious cycle. Let's overspend as a country's budget. What do? We have to have somebody finance that. That's the credit card called the U.S. Treasury. Somebody has to buy that. U.S. investors, foreign investors, our own government, and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve uses that as an asset to create more money. They inject more money in the system, dilutes the system in the hopes to stimulate the economy. And then the thing goes over and over and over. While this is happening, the national debt just keeps growing. Let's take a look at the chart of the national debt. Here we have years and years where the national debt is flat. But if you get into somewhere around the early 70s, they're starting just slightly increase. So remember that year, 1971-ish. And then we look to 1980, 81. Again, 1982, President Reagan was in office. Look at what happened. There started to be uptick. Okay, and then it just continued to escalate. Here we have a prime example of MMT, modern monetary theory, being proven in our national debt.